You're nothing." The words didn't echo. They landed, sharp and clean, like a verdict already decided, slicing through the low hum of jazz and the quiet clink of crystal in a Manhattan penthouse restaurant where every seat cost more than most people's rent. And for a second, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, as if even the chandeliers understood something had just shifted. Naomi Brooks didn't flinch, not when the laughter followed. Not when Victoria Hayes leaned back in her chair with that effortless, practiced smile of someone who had never once been questioned, and certainly not when a few heads turned just enough to watch without getting involved. Because in rooms like this, power wasn't loud. It was assumed, worn like tailored silk and diamond watches, and the unspoken rule that people like Naomi were part of the furniture, invisible until needed and dismissed the moment they weren't. Naomi stood there in her pressed black uniform, hands steady around a silver tray that reflected fragments of the scene back at her, golden light, expensive faces, a version of herself they thought they understood, and for a fraction of a second, something flickered behind her eyes, not anger, not embarrassment, something quieter, something far more controlled. Across the table, Ethan Caldwell barely reacted, his posture relaxed, his attention split between his phone and the investor meeting he believed he was dominating tonight. The kind of man who built empires on decisions made in seconds and rarely looked twice at the people pouring his water, while Victoria, draped in elegance and certainty, tapped her glass lightly and added, almost casually, "I mean, look at her. She doesn't even belong in the same room." And this time the laughter came quicker, easier, because it's always simpler to agree with power than to question it. But Naomi didn't respond the way they expected. She didn't shrink, didn't apologize, didn't rush away like a shadow retreating from light. Instead, she smiled. Slow and deliberate, the kind of smile that didn't ask for approval and didn't need permission. And that was the first crack, subtle but undeniable, because confidence from someone they had already labeled as nothing didn't fit the script. Somewhere behind her, a chair shifted softly, barely noticeable. But Naomi had already registered it long before anyone else. Because while they had been talking, performing, underestimating, she had been observing, calculating, listening to every word, every tone, every assumption layered beneath their voices. And in spaces like this, the most dangerous person is never the loudest. It's the one who sees everything and says nothing until the exact right moment. Naomi adjusted the tray in her hands, the motion smooth, almost routine, and then she turned, not toward the exit, not toward the kitchen, but slightly to her left, her gaze lifting past the table, past Victoria, past Ethan, landing on someone who had been there the entire time, unnoticed by the very people trying so hard to control the room. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, measured, unmistakably clear. It didn't carry anger, it carried authority, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. "Mr. Harrington," she said, as if the name itself weighed more than everything that had just been said about her. "I believe you've seen enough." And in that instant, the air changed, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the way it always does right before everything flips, when the people who thought they understood the game realize, just a second too late, that they were never the ones in control. The name hung in the air longer than it should have, not because it was unfamiliar, but because of who had spoken it. And for the first time that night, Ethan Caldwell looked up from his phone with something close to irritation before it shifted into confusion, his eyes following Naomi's line of sight as a quiet murmur rippled through the room, subtle at first, like the beginning of a storm no one wanted to acknowledge. Victoria's smile faltered, just slightly, the kind of micro-expression that would have gone unnoticed anywhere else but here, under lights that revealed more than they concealed. And behind Naomi, a man who had been sitting in stillness the entire evening finally moved, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with the calm certainty of someone who never needed to announce his presence to be felt. Richard Harrington stood, adjusting the cuff of his navy jacket with a measured ease, his expression unreadable, yet unmistakably focused. And as he stepped forward, conversations at nearby tables softened, then stopped entirely, because even in a room full of influence, there are levels to power, and his was the kind that reshaped outcomes without raising his voice. Ethan straightened in his chair now, the confidence that once filled his posture tightening into something more alert, more cautious as recognition settled in. Because this was not just another investor, not just another name on a contract. This was the man whose decision could close or collapse a $2 billion acquisition that Ethan had spent the last 6 months chasing. Victoria turned, her composure returning just enough to mask the shift beneath it. Though her voice carried a trace of uncertainty she could not fully hide. "Mr. Harrington, I did not realize you were joining us tonight," she said, her tone polished, practiced, but the response she received was not what she expected, because Harrington did not look at her, not immediately. His attention remained on Naomi for a fraction longer than necessary, as if acknowledging something no one else in the room had yet understood, before his gaze moved, slowly, deliberately, to Ethan. "I was already here," he replied, his voice even, unhurried, the kind of voice that does not compete for attention, because it commands it naturally. And that was when the shift became undeniable, when the invisible hierarchy everyone had been operating under began to rearrange itself in real time. Naomi stepped back just enough to clear the space, not retreating, not shrinking, simply repositioning herself like someone who knew exactly where she stood, her expression calm, composed, unchanged, while around her, the energy in the room recalibrated. Guests who had laughed moments ago now watched in silence, their curiosity sharpening into something more cautious, more aware, because the narrative they had been comfortable with was slipping. Ethan rose to his feet, extending his hand, his voice measured, though no longer effortless. "Mr. Harrington, it is an honor. We were just discussing the final terms," he said, attempting to reclaim control of a conversation that was no longer his to lead. But Harrington did not take his hand right away. Instead, he glanced once more toward Naomi, then back to Ethan, and in that pause, brief but deliberate, the message was clear without needing explanation, that what had just happened mattered, that it had been seen, and more importantly, that it would not be ignored. Victoria shifted in her seat, the weight of the moment pressing in from all sides, her earlier certainty dissolving into something tighter, something quieter, as the realization settled that the room she thought she understood had just changed shape, and Naomi, still holding that same silver tray, still standing in the same place, was no longer part of the background, not anymore. Because sometimes the difference between being invisible and being undeniable is not volume, not force, but timing. And Naomi had chosen hers perfectly. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, slowly, like a room learning how to breathe again under new rules. And Richard Harrington finally extended his hand, not to Ethan, but toward Naomi, a gesture so subtle, yet so precise that it redrew every invisible line in the space. And Naomi, without hesitation, placed the tray onto a nearby table and met his hand with calm confidence, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, as if this moment was not unexpected but simply overdue. A ripple moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, because people were no longer watching a waitress being dismissed, they were watching someone being acknowledged, and that difference carried weight heavier than any spoken apology. Ethan lowered his hand slowly, the realization settling deeper now, not just about who Harrington was, but about what had just been witnessed, what had been said, and how quickly perception could turn into consequence when the right person was paying attention. Victoria remained seated, her fingers tightening slightly around the stem of her glass, her composure still intact on the surface but fractured underneath, because for the first time that night, she was no longer the one controlling the tone of the room, and she knew it. Harrington released Naomi's hand and turned his attention fully to Ethan, his voice measured, deliberate. "I prefer to understand the people behind a company before I finalize anything," he said, his words simple, but layered with intention, and the implication settled heavily between them, because this was no longer just about numbers or projections or quarterly growth. It was about judgment, character, and the kind of decisions that cannot be hidden behind polished presentations. Ethan nodded, attempting to regain footing, his voice steady but no longer effortless. "Of course, and I assure you, our company reflects the highest standards," he replied, choosing his words carefully now. aware that every sentence carried more weight than it had just minutes ago. But Harrington did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced briefly toward Naomi again, then back at Ethan, and in that glance was a quiet contradiction, one that did not need to be spoken aloud to be understood. Naomi stepped back into position, not returning to invisibility, but standing with a presence that no longer needed to be announced, her silence now louder than anything that had been said earlier, because the room had already adjusted around her, recalibrated its understanding of who mattered and why. A guest at a nearby table shifted in his seat, lowering his voice as he whispered to the person beside him, while another discreetly set down his glass, both reacting to the same realization that was spreading quietly across the room, that the balance had changed, and not in a way that could be undone with a smile or a correction. Victoria finally stood, smoothing her dress with controlled precision, stepping forward just enough to re-enter the conversation, her tone softer now, recalibrated. "Perhaps we should continue discussing the terms," she said, her voice careful, measured. But even as she spoke, it was clear that the rhythm of the evening no longer followed her lead, because power, once shifted, rarely returns to its original place without resistance. Harrington gave a slight nod, though his expression remained neutral, unreadable, and as he moved toward the table, the energy followed him, leaving behind the echo of what had just occurred, an unspoken understanding that lingered in every glance and every pause, because the room had not just witnessed a moment, it had witnessed a recalibration of value, and Naomi, who had been called nothing just moments ago, now stood at the center of a silence that said everything. The table was no longer just a place for dinner. It had become a stage where every glance carried meaning and every pause held consequence. And as Richard Harrington took his seat, the weight of his presence settled into the polished wood like an invisible contract being rewritten in real time. Ethan Caldwell adjusted his jacket, smoothing a crease that was not there, a small movement meant to restore control. But control was no longer something he could perform. It was something he had to earn back, and for the first time that evening, he understood that the room was no longer responding to his rhythm. It was waiting for Harrington's. Naomi moved quietly along the edge of the table, refilling a glass with steady hands, her motions precise, unhurried, not avoiding attention but no longer shaped by it either, because once someone is seen, truly seen, they do not return to being invisible, no matter how much the room wishes they would. Victoria sat straighter now, her earlier confidence replaced with calculation, her eyes flicking briefly toward Naomi before returning to Harrington, as if trying to measure how much of what had happened could still be undone. But moments like that do not rewind. They settle, they echo, they define. Harrington leaned back slightly, his gaze moving across the table, not rushed, not distracted, but deliberate, observing not just what was being said but how it was being said, who spoke, who hesitated, who avoided eye contact, and in that quiet observation was a different kind of evaluation, one that no presentation slide could prepare for. "Let us talk about alignment," he said finally, his voice calm, steady, the kind that does not need emphasis because it already carries authority, and the word itself landed heavier than any financial term discussed earlier, because alignment was no longer about strategy, it was about values, about judgment, about the way people treated those they believed had nothing to offer them. Ethan nodded, leaning forward slightly, his tone controlled, careful. "Our company prioritizes integrity across every level," he said, choosing each word with precision. But even as he spoke, the contrast between the statement and the memory of moments ago lingered in the air, unspoken but undeniable, like a reflection no one could fully avoid. Naomi stepped back again, her presence now woven into the atmosphere of the room rather than standing apart from it. And as she passed behind Harrington, he spoke without turning, his voice low but clear enough to carry. "Ms. Brooks, would you stay for a moment?" And the request was simple, yet it shifted everything once more, because it was not a command, not a gesture of convenience, it was an acknowledgement of relevance. Victoria's fingers tightened briefly against the table, her composure holding but thinner now, stretched by the realization that the narrative she had set in motion had not just failed, it had reversed, and there was no graceful way to step out of it. Naomi paused, turning slightly, meeting Harrington's words with the same calm she had carried all night. "Of course, sir," she replied, her voice even, grounded, and in that exchange, brief as it was, the room felt the shift deepen, because respect, once introduced into a space that lacked it, does not remain quiet. It amplifies, it exposes, it demands recognition. Ethan exhaled slowly, barely noticeable, but enough to signal the internal recalibration happening beneath his composed exterior, because he was beginning to understand that this was no longer about securing a deal, it was about proving he deserved one. And as Harrington's attention returned to him, the message was clear without being spoken, that the outcome of this night would not be decided by numbers alone, but by something far less negotiable, something that had already been tested and quietly, irrevocably, revealed. The word alignment lingered in the air like a question no one could dodge, and for a moment, no one spoke, not because they did not have answers, but because they were suddenly aware that the wrong one could cost more than money. Ethan Caldwell leaned forward slightly, his fingers interlaced on the table, posture precise, voice measured. "We believe alignment begins with leadership," he said, each word carefully placed, as if precision alone could rebuild what had already cracked. But across from him, Richard Harrington did not react immediately, his gaze steady, almost patient, the kind of patience that does not rush because it already knows the outcome will reveal itself. Naomi Brooks stood just behind him now, not as background, not as an accessory to the room, but as a quiet axis around which the atmosphere had begun to turn, her presence no longer questioned, only observed. And that observation carried a different kind of weight, one that did not need explanation to be understood. Victoria Hayes shifted slightly in her chair, her earlier confidence replaced by something more strategic, her smile softer now, calibrated. "What Ethan means is that we value people at every level," she added, her tone smooth, practiced, but even as she spoke, the words felt lighter than the moment required, as if they could not quite reach the standard that had just been set without effort. Harrington tilted his head just slightly, considering, then asked, "At every level?" And the simplicity of the question made it heavier, because it was not a challenge. It was a mirror, reflecting back not just what had been said, but what had been done. Ethan held the gaze, nodding once. "Absolutely," he replied, but the confidence behind it had shifted, no longer absolute, now conditional, shaped by the awareness that the room had seen more than he intended to reveal. Naomi moved to refill a glass again, the soft sound of liquid meeting crystal cutting gently through the silence. And in that small action was a reminder, not loud, not confrontational, but present, that respect is not declared, it is demonstrated, often in moments people assume no one important is watching. Harrington finally leaned forward, resting his hands lightly on the table, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Then help me understand something," he said, his eyes moving briefly toward Naomi before returning to Ethan. "How does a company that values people at every level allow someone in this room to be treated as if they have none?" And the question did not echo. It settled, heavy and immediate, because there was no simple answer, no quick redirection, only the truth waiting to be acknowledged or avoided. Victoria's breath caught just enough to register, her composure holding but thinner now, as if stretched across a realization she could no longer ignore, while Ethan remained still, the weight of the moment pressing in, forcing a calculation that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with accountability. Naomi stepped back again, her role returning to motion but not to invisibility, because the question now belonged to the room, and the room was listening differently, no longer entertained, no longer passive, but engaged in a quiet evaluation of what would come next. Because sometimes the most defining moments are not the loudest, they are the ones where silence demands an answer, and everyone knows that whatever is said next will not just shape a deal, it will define who deserves one. No one rushed to answer, and that hesitation said more than any confident reply could have, because in rooms built on certainty, silence is never empty. It is revealing. Ethan Caldwell inhaled slowly, the kind of controlled breath meant to steady a narrative that had begun to slip beyond his grasp. And when he spoke, his voice carried a new weight, not just authority, but awareness. "That should not have happened," he said, choosing honesty over deflection. even if it came a moment too late. And while the sentence was simple, it shifted something, because acknowledgement, when it is real, does not need decoration. Victoria Hayes turned her head slightly toward him, her expression tightening at the edges, as if recalculating the situation in real time, because this was not the script she had expected, not the outcome she had rehearsed, and yet she remained silent, her earlier confidence now replaced by a careful restraint that bordered on uncertainty. Harrington watched without interruption, his gaze steady, not punitive, not forgiving, simply observant, the kind of observation that allows people to reveal who they are without interference. And that was precisely what made it powerful. Naomi Brooks stood a few steps back, her posture relaxed but grounded, her presence no longer a question but a constant. And as the room waited, she did not look at Ethan, she did not look at Victoria. She simply remained still, as if the moment no longer required her to prove anything, because it did not. Ethan continued, his tone measured, deliberate. We build systems, we train teams, but moments like this, they reflect leadership, he said. And there was a pause, brief but intentional, before he added, and leadership starts with me. And that was the second shift, quieter than the first, but just as important, because accountability, when it is accepted, begins to rebuild what arrogance quietly dismantles. A murmur moved faintly through the room, not disruptive, not loud, but present, because people recognize sincerity even when they are not expecting it. And in that recognition, something softened, not enough to erase what had happened, but enough to allow for a different outcome. Harrington leaned back slightly, considering, his fingers resting lightly against the edge of the table. Then show me, he said, his voice calm, almost neutral, but the challenge within. It was unmistakable, because words, no matter how carefully chosen, only carry value when they are followed by action. Ethan nodded once, understanding that the moment was not over, that this was not a conclusion but a test still unfolding. And as he turned slightly, his attention moved toward Naomi, not as an afterthought, not as a correction, but as a deliberate shift in focus, one that acknowledged her presence in a way that could not be mistaken. Victoria watched this exchange in silence, her earlier remarks now hanging in the air like a shadow she could not step out of. And for the first time that evening, she did not attempt to redirect, did not attempt to speak, because the room had already moved past her voice. Naomi met Ethan's gaze calmly, not with expectation, not with hesitation, simply with the same composed clarity she had carried from the beginning. And in that moment, the balance between them was no longer defined by titles or roles, but by something far more equal, far more real. The music in the background resumed its quiet rhythm, the soft clink of glasses returning as the room slowly exhaled. But the atmosphere remained changed, because once a moment like this unfolds, it does not disappear. It becomes part of the space, part of the memory, part of the story people will carry long after the night ends. And as Harrington's attention remained fixed, patient, and unwavering, it was clear that what came next would not be decided by status or assumption, but by whether the person who once held the power could now rise to the standard he had just claimed. The challenge did not echo. It settled, heavy and precise. And for a moment Ethan Caldwell did not move, not because he lacked an answer, but because he understood that anything rushed would collapse under the weight of what had just been exposed. The room watched him now, not with admiration, not with expectation, but with a quiet scrutiny that had not been there before, the kind that measures not what a man says, but what he chooses to do when everything is already on the line. Ethan stepped back from the table slightly, a subtle shift, but intentional, creating space not just physically, but symbolically, as if acknowledging that the center of the moment no longer belonged to him alone. And then he turned fully toward Naomi Brooks, his posture no longer towering, no longer distant, but level, deliberate, present. Ms. Brooks, he said, his voice steady, stripped of performance. What you experienced tonight should not have happened, not here, not in any place connected to my name. And the words were simple, but they carried a different kind of weight now, because they were not spoken upward to impress, they were spoken across, to recognize. Victoria Hayes shifted sharply in her chair, the movement small but charged, her composure tightening as if resisting the direction the moment was taking. Because acknowledgement given publicly is not just correction, it is exposure. And exposure does not ask for permission. Ethan did not look back at her, did not soften or adjust, because the moment had moved beyond comfort, and comfort was no longer the priority. Naomi met his gaze without hesitation, her expression calm, unreadable, not dismissive, not forgiving, simply present, as if allowing him to finish what he had started without offering him relief. And I take responsibility for that, Ethan continued, his tone unwavering. Because leadership is not what happens when things go right. It is what we do when they do not. And this time, the silence that followed felt different, not tense, not frozen, but attentive, as if the room itself was leaning in to see if this was real or just another performance dressed in better words. Harrington remained still, his eyes fixed, not interrupting, not reacting, giving the moment room to either prove itself or fall apart under its own weight. Naomi nodded once, a small acknowledgement, not acceptance, not rejection, simply recognition that the words had been spoken, and in that nod was a quiet control that shifted the balance yet again, because she was no longer the subject of the moment, she was part of its outcome. Ethan paused briefly, then added, "If you are willing, I would like to hear your perspective," and that was the third shift, the most subtle, but perhaps the most important, because respect is not only in apology, it is an invitation, in the willingness to listen where others assumed there was nothing worth hearing. Victoria exhaled softly, almost inaudible, her earlier certainty now reduced to observation, because the conversation had moved beyond her reach, beyond her influence. And for the first time that evening, she was the one outside the center. Naomi took a step forward, not rushed, not hesitant, her presence steady as the light caught the edge of the silver tray beside her. And as she prepared to speak, the room grew quiet again. But this silence was not imposed. It was chosen, because everyone understood, instinctively, that whatever came next would not just respond to what had happened, it would define what it meant. Naomi Brooks did not rush her words. She did not fill the silence to make others comfortable. She let it sit, let it stretch just long enough for everyone in the room to feel the weight of what had been asked. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and clear, not raised, not emotional, but grounded in something far stronger than reaction. "You did not see me," she said, her eyes moving briefly from Ethan Caldwell to Victoria Hayes, then back again, not accusing, not pleading, simply stating a truth that did not need decoration. "Not because I was invisible, but because you decided I was." And the words landed differently than anything before them, not sharp, not loud, but undeniable, like a mirror no one could turn away from. The room remained still, not frozen, but attentive, because this was no longer about a single moment of disrespect. It was about the pattern beneath it, the assumption that some people existed only in the background until they disrupted it. Naomi continued, her tone even, her posture unchanged. "I do my job well, not to be noticed, but because that is who I am," she said. And there was a quiet strength in that sentence, a confidence that did not rely on validation. But when respect is missing, it is not a small thing, it changes the entire room. And as she spoke, the meaning extended beyond the table, beyond the dinner, into something larger, something everyone present understood but rarely named. Victoria shifted again, her expression tightening, her earlier words now echoing back at her without defense. Because there are moments when silence is not chosen, it is required, when speaking would only make the truth louder. Ethan listened without interruption, his gaze steady, not defensive, not dismissive, but focused, absorbing each word not as criticism, but as clarity. And in that listening was a shift that could not be faked. Because real attention does not interrupt, it receives. Harrington remained still, his presence unchanged, but his eyes moved slightly, tracking the exchange with a quiet precision, as if measuring not just what was being said, but how it was being heard. Naomi paused, briefly, not searching for words, but allowing them to settle, then added, "Respect is not something you announce. It is something people feel before you say anything at all." And that sentence carried through the room like a low current, touching every listener in a different way, because it spoke to something simple and often ignored. A glass was set down softly at a nearby table, the small sound echoing more than it should have, because the room had grown so quiet that even the smallest movement felt amplified. And in that quiet, Naomi's presence stood at the center, not elevated by volume, but by truth. She did not ask for anything. She did not demand correction. She simply finished, "That is all I wanted to say," and stepped back, not retreating, not disappearing, but returning to her place with the same calm she had carried from the beginning. And yet nothing about her place was the same anymore. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of her words settling into something deeper than strategy, something that could not be solved with negotiation. And as he looked at her, then at Harrington, it became clear that the decision ahead was no longer about profit or timing. It was about whether he could align his actions with the standard that had just been defined. Because in that moment, the most valuable thing in the room was not the deal, it was the truth that had just been spoken, and everyone knew it. For a moment after Naomi Brooks finished speaking, no one moved, not because they were unsure of what to do, but because they understood that whatever came next would define everything that had just been laid bare. And Richard Harrington finally leaned forward, his hands resting lightly on the table, his gaze steady on Ethan Caldwell. "That," he said quietly, "is alignment." And the simplicity of the statement carried more weight than any contract clause discussed that evening, because it did not reference numbers, it referenced truth. Ethan nodded slowly, not in agreement alone, but in recognition, as if something had shifted internally that could not be reversed. And when he spoke, his voice no longer carried the sharp edge of control, but the grounded tone of someone who had chosen a direction. "Then that is the standard we meet," he said. And there was no hesitation this time, no calculation behind the words, only clarity. Victoria Hayes lowered her gaze briefly, the polished confidence she had worn all night finally giving way to something quieter, something reflective, because the room no longer required her performance, it required her awareness, and awareness, once reached, does not allow for easy escape. Harrington studied Ethan for a moment. Longer, not searching for perfection, but for consistency, for the alignment between what had been said and what would follow. And after a measured pause, he gave a small nod, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but decisive, the kind of nod that closes deals and opens new expectations at the same time. "We will proceed," he said, his voice calm, final, and the tension that had been building throughout the evening did not break. It transformed, settling into something steadier, something earned. A quiet shift moved through the room as conversations resumed, softer now, more aware, as if everyone present had been reminded of something they had forgotten to value, something that could not be measured but could change everything. Ethan turned slightly toward Naomi, not as a formality, not as a gesture for others to see, but as a deliberate acknowledgement, and while he did not speak again, the look itself carried what words could not fully express, because respect, once understood, often becomes quieter, but more real. Naomi gave a small nod in return, not seeking recognition, not holding on to the moment, simply accepting it for what it was, a correction, not a victory. And then she reached for the tray again, her movements smooth, composed, returning to her work not because she had to, but because her role had never defined her worth, only revealed it. Victoria remained still for a moment longer before rising, her posture refined, but her expression changed, the edge gone, replaced with something more measured, more aware, as if the evening had taught her something she had not expected to learn. Harrington leaned back once more, the decision behind him now, but the lesson still present, woven into the atmosphere of the room, into the memory of everyone who had witnessed it, because moments like this do not disappear when the night ends. They stay, shaping how people see, how they speak, how they lead. And as the music resumed its gentle rhythm and the city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls, one truth remained clear, quiet but undeniable, that power may fill a room, but it is dignity that defines it. And on this night, it was not the loudest voice that changed everything. It was the one that chose to speak with calm, with clarity, and with the kind of strength that does not need to be announced to be understood.
The stories shared on this channel are fictional and created purely for entertainment purposes, as well as to convey lessons about human behavior and interactions. regardless of race, religion, or background, promoting a life of equality and compassion. Any resemblance to real events, people, or places is purely coincidental.